Thank you very, very much for attending this seminar. ESG, Making Sense of the Madness. My name is Karl. I'm a professor of finance here at IMD. A warm good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the universe of IMD. Compared to the other sort of leading in turbulent times, from a very dark Auckland. Wow, yes, I wish I could be in Auckland right now. This is a little bit on the depressing side. It's not going to be leadership, making you a better leader, and we all love each other and hug each other. It's a little bit depressing, this topic. Now, as you know, ESG is a topic. There is a lot of politics in it, ethics, people moralize. I'm going to stay away from that, or I'm going to try to stay away from that. And I want to look at the problem through the lens of economics. Before I do this, I'm going to take a little bit of a macroeconomic view here. So for those of you who are interested in business transformation and changing your business, I highly recommend a new open program from IMD, Leading Sustainable Business Transformation. And there we sort of go from a macro level to a micro level to really implementing change on sort of the company level. Now, as I said, I will take a look sort of at the economics viewpoint. Now, before we get into details, I think it helps to have sort of a definition. What is ESG? On the website of the European Union, you find the following definition. Sustainable finance refers to the process of taking environmental, E, social, S, and governance, G, consideration into account when making investment decisions. In the financial sector, but then also companies making investments into new projects. The E, environmental consideration, refers to climate change mitigation and adaptation. We're going to talk about what that means exactly a little while. In particular, it also concerns biodiversity. Sometimes biodiversity is falling off the wagon because there's so much focus on global warming. But the loss of biodiversity is also very critical on the globe. S, social considerations, refer to such issues as inequality, be still inclusive, and other points. Now, I have to admit to you, I only have 55 minutes here, so I can't do justice to this topic. This topic is humongous. So I will mostly talk about the E and a little bit about the S. G, I take as a given. Yes, it's a big topic in itself. I just don't have the time. So it's E and S is the focus here. Now, we live in a changing world. May 26th saw three major events. Bloomberg wrote a couple of days later, Wednesday was a bad day for big oil or a good one, depending on your point of view. What happened on May 26th? Shareholders at Exxon voted to appoint first two, and then there was a close election. Somehow Americans seem to have a knack for close elections. Then in the end, three climate conscious members to the company's board against very strong opposition from the management, from the C-suite. They didn't want that. Chevron, this fell a little bit off the bandwagon, but it's still very important. When you look at emissions, they are so-called different scopes. And at Chevron, the shareholders said we need to take into account scope 3 as well, not only scope 1 or 2. And that makes for Chevron a big difference because now they need to be concerned about what their customers do with the oil and those emissions. And then in Europe, a court in The Hague ordered Shell, which likes to think of itself as green relative to the Chevrons and Exxons of this world, they ordered them to cut their greenhouse gas emissions even more than they had originally aimed. So big changes in big oil, and in particular, the Exxon and Shell events really sort of were all over the news and sort of shocked some investors. Now, I can add a new bad four-letter word to your vocabulary. In addition to the other two, the latest one is coal. Coal is bad and is is blacklisted. Here, fascinating article just a few weeks ago in Bloomberg. Half of China's backed overseas coal projects are shelved. Some of them are already canceled. So as you know, China invests in many developing countries, tries to help them invest. Some observers in the Western world are very concerned about political dependencies, but that's a political issue. And for example, they funded a new coal-powered plant in Bangladesh. And that's the only one out of 52 projects that had been announced that now went into operation. And the Bangladeshis are already mad about it because it pollutes the hell out of in the area. So some people say, oh, I'm going to I don't want your free money. Great. I just walk away from the free money. We see this finance is leaving thermal coal from an energy research institution. Then now, and this is around the world, the Asian Development Bank promised to end coal, oil, and even gas financing. In Malaysia, the largest bank in Malaysia, Maybank, said they don't want to invest in new coal-powered plants. So we really see around the world some big changes. But then, wait a minute. On June 13, there were 3 votes that were related to the environment in green Switzerland. And the environment lost 0-3. Here, news from the BBC, they said, wow, this is a huge shock. Swiss voters don't want even stricter limitations on emissions. Then there will also a vote on artificial pesticides and related to on drinking water. Always the environment lost. So we see a mess. We see some big changes, in particular around fossil fuels, but then some voters in a rich European country saying, no, game on, no, we had it. So what is your view on ESG? I would like to hear or see from the audience in a Zoom poll, is ESG mostly the hype of the moment, the flavor of the moment, and so we use it for advertising? Is it important but totally overhyped in your opinion? Does it receive the appropriate level of attention, or do you think we need to do even more? So let's do a poll. Here we go. 13 people in the audience, 5% said it's a marketing hype and good for brand image. 21% say it's overhyped. The right level is only 4%, and the vast majority, 70%, say it deserves more attention and it will be critical importance. So that's a very strong vote, but it's by no means 98 or 100. So we still have people and think it's overhyped, and clearly it's easy to be cynical. In dark moments, I'm very cynical, and I think number one is what we see right now. Let's continue this. Many thanks for voting, and here we go. Now, as I said, let's put morals aside, ethics, your political orientation. Let's look at climate change from economic viewpoint. What is climate change? And how how does economic think about? Because when we understand that view, we understand what's currently happening in the sense of policy actions around the world. So I'm sure all of you have heard about the Paris Agreement. Actually, the Paris Agreement came out of the so-called Conference of Parties, the 21st meeting in December 2015. Everything started actually in 1992 in a meeting in Rio. So that was by now almost 30 years ago. There were many meetings. Paris was number 21. This November, we will have meeting number 26, if COVID allows it, in Glasgow. And when you have heard about this or read in the newspapers, oh, we want to keep the global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, or ideally below 1.5 degrees Celsius, that comes out of Paris. And in that sense, Paris was different. It became way more goal-focused and operational, from lofty goals to here's some numbers, here's something more concrete. Here you see the map of the world, which countries signed and ratified the meeting. There was an update in February 2021 because the United States had left the Paris Agreement under the previous president, and then under the new president, they returned to the agreement. What's so interesting about Paris in relation to finance? The Paris Agreement, Article 9, paragraph 3, calls explicitly to mobilize climate finance from a wide variety of sources, la da 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 da. So finance, or in particular climate finance, is explicitly mentioned in this agreement, that finance plays a big role. Why? Because finance companies give money to loans. You as a private investor, if you buy shares and give money to if a company issues new shares and you give them money, that money is then invested, perhaps in brown or green projects. And so this is why Paris Agreement explicitly asks finance to get involved. Now, what is climate finance? If you go from sustainable finance to a sort of smaller area, climate finance, or sub-theme, local, national, transnational financing from public, private, and other sources that for mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation means we really want to reduce emissions. So investments that are meant to reduce emissions are called then mitigation. If you just say, listen, it's all too late anyway, the climate is going to go to hell, let's just try to survive, we want to adapt to the adverse effects. One of the ironies of history is that the former US president, on the one hand, denied climate change, and on the other hand, built higher walls around his golf courses in Scotland, I believe Scotland or Ireland, I think it's Scotland, in order to keep the ocean water off his greens. So adaptation is like building walls around your country club. Now, what is the outcome of Paris and all these good things since Rio? 21 meetings till Paris, 25 meetings until now. This is the outcome. We pollute still like crazy, and we see more and more damages. The upper right-hand corner is from Delhi, New Delhi smog. I found a picture with the kangaroo, so you know this is a fires in Australia last year, and we still pollute the the hell out of the world. Now, let's look at some numbers. On the left-hand side, you see the annual total CO2 emissions. This is just CO2. There are other gases, and then sometimes you hear CO2 equivalent. That's then when these other gases, greenhouse gases, are translated into CO2 that would have the same effect. We see, and now remember, we started out here, the meetings, Rio started out in 92. Yeah, and you see, wow, this is going up, up, up. Maybe it's not going up as fast as it would have gone up otherwise, but it's difficult to say, wow, we had a really strong impact here. It's going up. We see here Asia without China and India has become a huge actor. China is large, India. Here we have the United States and the European Union. On a per capita basis, Mongolia is the worst offender. If I read, yeah, this seems to be the darkest here. I guess they don't have many people there, so the denominator is kind of small. But we see, yeah, North America and Saudi Arabia, Australia, and so on are on a per capita basis the worst offenders. So we see that despite these efforts, emissions are going up. What is the result of all of that? Temperatures are rising. Here on the left, we see a temperature graph relative to the average temperature from the mid-50s to the mid-80s. So if you say mid-50s to mid-80s, let's look at the average and then compare every year relative to that average. We see that early in the 20th century, actually temperatures were below that average. It was a little colder. And then we see that in the last 40 years, yeah, we had constantly above average temperatures. And it's going up and up. In particular, and this is a big problem, it's going up around the poles. And Anand, yes, I share all the slides happily, will do that. In particular at the poles, where we have a lot of water stored in the form of ice, temperatures going up, melting, rising sea levels, and so on. So that's the status quo. Now, if you ask the climate scientists, they say, listen, we are failing. Yeah, so this is all, the sources here are National Geographic, a beautiful science magazine for all of us from 2019, then Nature, academic journal, the scientists say, listen, yeah, we are falling short. Yes, there are some efforts, but we are falling short. Emissions are still rising. That's sort of the status quo. So, and now I want you to understand and take away why that is the case without thinking about morals and ethics and these people are bad and we don't like those people. None of that. Economics. So, here's a quote, two great quotes. Sir Nicholas Stern, a leading climate science researcher in the UK. He wasn't born a sir, he got it for his great work. He has said, climate change is the result of the greatest market failure the world has seen. So he talks about a market failure. Whoop. Yeah, for someone, yeah, at IMD, we teach market economics, we believe in markets. Oh, markets are failing. We want to understand that. Climate change is the mother of all externalities. From an economic paper by Richard Toll, also a very distinguished climate researcher. Climate change is the mother of all externalities. We want to understand what that means and what the economics is doing here. So in a moment, I show you what's happening to cement and cement production on the globe. So you are, let's say you're a cement producer. You create CO2 emissions. That's an undesirable side effect. Actually, the chemistry of the process creates CO2. It's not because that company is bad. No, very much the science says if you make cement, CO2 is gone. Now, that CO2 affects all of us. It doesn't affect that much, perhaps not at all, the cement manufacturer, but it's out there in the world. We are breathing that CO2 later. It's warming the planet. But the company that benefits from making cement has no or little impact. It gets worse. That CO2 stays out there for a while. And it warms the planet. So it has grave repercussions on future generations, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. They don't vote right now. They cannot vote. Many of them are not born yet. So they don't have a word yet. So we are not nice to them. So the responsible economic agents do not bear the cost. It's other people bearing the cost. Now, if there's something that doesn't cost anything to me, I'm happy to produce it. Doesn't cost me anything, doesn't do me any bad. So I have no incentive. If I'm now the cement producer, sorry, I'm mixing the story, then why should I reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So as a result, there's a massive overproduction. And now, because there is no price, because there is no economic cost on this negative side effect, it's not priced in markets, it's outside our markets of prices, cost, benefit, then it's called a negative externality. Greenhouse gas emissions are a negative externality, and negative externalities are one, among other examples, why markets may fail. Now, please allow me to go just a tad deeper into what's happening here. In the right-hand corner, you see the reaction, the chemical reaction that needs to happen to create cement. You take limestone, you heat it up like crazy. Of course, heating up costs a lot. There's a lot of CO2 in that. I'm going to ignore that CO2. Where you get your electricity, yeah, I'm ignoring that. That's not part of the story right now. That makes it, of course, much worse. So limestone plus heat gives you the clinker you need for cement and CO2. So here on the left, you see the production in millions of tons of cement in the last 5 years, 2010 to 2015. It has gone up modestly, not hugely. Yeah? And exactly, you have a relationship here on the CO2. Now, and you can see here, we are roughly for 1 ton of cement, 1/3 of a ton of CO2 is produced just from this reaction. There's still, yeah, how is the heat produced? If that comes out of a coal-powered plant, that adds to it. So then the question is, how big is cement production? Is that important? Look at this number here. And interestingly, and don't cancel me for citing this gentleman, he was a hero until half a year ago, but he's now in hot water because he seems to be a much worse person than we all thought. Bill Gates did this, found this, calculated this first. People have looked at it, and it seems to be right. China produced 6.6 gigatons of cement in 3 years, from 2011 to 2013. The US produced 4.5 gigatons in an entire century. Think about this. China produces more cement in 3 years than the US in the golden century of American history. So why is that? Yeah, in the US, a lot of buildings, in particular residential buildings, are made out of wood. America, the United States, North America has a huge amount of wood, so they can do that. And then those houses are poorly insulated, so then they use a lot of electricity on warming or cooling them. China doesn't have the same amount of wood. So as a result, they create many more buildings out of concrete. Concrete needs cement. Now, again, Bill Gates on his blog talked about this, and lots of people thought the guy must be nuts. This can't be true. But more and more people sort of see the numbers are right. So, and now please allow me to be really nerdy for just a couple minutes. Back to Econ 101. Maybe you remember these curves. We have the demand curve, the demand for a product. So we have at a high price, the demand is low. Yeah, quantity is here on the horizontal axis. Only few people buy this product if it's very expensive. The smaller the price, the higher the demand, the quantity that people are willing to buy. On the other hand, we have the supply curve. At low prices, the supply from companies will be very low. As prices go up, you may be willing to produce more and more and more at higher and higher marginal costs. You need a higher price to break even. This is a schematic figure. Doesn't matter whether these are nonlinear, curved, whatever. This is a basic picture. And then economics tells us, we're going to have an equilibrium, a price where the supply just equals the demand. That's what economics tells us. Now, the problem is here in the supply, of course, a company wants to cover its marginal cost. And so it gets a contribution to fixed cost and then to profit. Now, the issue is that based on the private cost that a company has, the equilibrium is this quantity. But now remember what I told you about greenhouse gas emissions. They are costly to the world, to you and me, but not to the cement manufacturer. So that company doesn't feel those costs. But if we were to put that cost into the calculation, we would move from the private cost to the social cost, which are the private cost of producing cement to the manufacturer, the producer, plus the social cost, the damage to all of us. And then the cost curve would move up. At a given quantity, if this much cement is produced, the costs are not here. The costs are really there because there's this additional damage. And so we really should be only producing that much. We still should produce cement, economics tells us, but less. There is an overproduction here. And this is called here the negative externality. The social costs are the production costs, the private costs, everything that belongs to them for the cement manufacturer, plus the negative externality. And that's happening. And that's, however, is not priced. And so therefore we have overproduction. So that's the problem. And now you say, don't do this. Oh, you are bad. Don't do that. Yeah. We have been trying to do this since 1992. Doesn't work. What do we need? Here's this beautiful sentence. Most of economics can be summarized in 4 words. People respond to incentives. The rest is commentary. This distinguishes someone who understands a little bit of economics and all those tree huggers and do-gooders who don't understand that or who don't want to understand this. By the way, as a little private note to illustrate incentives, my son sometimes has this really messy room. And then my wife and my son get into screaming fights about this. And my wife is all upset. Oh, he doesn't clean up the room, doesn't clean up the room. So then I go to my son and say, listen, on Wednesday evening, there's a Champions League game of Bayern Munich. You want to watch that? Then you clean up your room now. If you don't clean up your room within 10 minutes, you're going to bed before the game starts. Guess how quickly the room is cleaned. That's incentives. And so this is now has been coming now for a number of years, but quite late. What we are right now seeing is that the policymakers, the regulators, the governments are changing the incentives for economic agents. That's you and me as consumers, you and me as running businesses or for the business. through policies. And what do they want to do? They want to change the game. They want to change market prices. So that's the idea behind everything we are saying. Change the incentives for the actors. How do you do this? Carbon tax is one solution. In the Wall Street Journal here in January of 2019, was an economist statement on, they call it carbon dividends here. A carbon tax offers the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions. By correcting a well-known market failure, here you have it. We have externalities, they are not priced, we have a market failure, we are producing too much of some bad stuff, we need to correct this. Now you may say, oh, yeah, some lefty crazy nutcases. Yeah, not at all. This has a broad support across the political spectrum. Here they only have the who is who, the most famous people that signed it. I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of people signed this. They are people from both sides of the political aisle in the United States. For example, Michael Boskin is at the Hoover Institution, right-wing think tank. He was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. He's a Republican. Alan Greenspan got his job because he's Republican leaning. Here is George Shultz, who served in the Reagan administration. So the point I want to make is that this has broad support now from across the political spectrum. Now, let's look at the share of global CO2 emissions that is covered by taxes and carbon trading, so-called cap and trade. It started out in 1990 in Scandinavia. There was very little until 2004, and in 2005, some countries in the European Union started a so-called cap and trade. I get to that in a second. And now it has been accelerating. And now even China is now planning to impose costs. The world leader in carbon taxes is Sweden. I don't know whether these dollar numbers are exactly right. I converted them to dollars a couple of weeks ago. At the time, the equivalent of the Swedish krona price was $143. Switzerland and Liechtenstein together are at 96 Swiss franc, and then Finland, Norway, France. So these are carbon taxes. Now, why you may say, why is so little covered? Yeah, of course, many countries don't have this. This only applies to the largest companies in the respective countries. In addition to carbon taxation, where the government says, here's a carbon tax, how many tons of CO2 are you emitting, and you have to pay for this. There's also so-called emission trading systems, where companies get permits to pollute, and if they pollute less, they can sell these permits. It's roughly equal right now. Unfortunately, in the short period of time, I can't go into the details of emission trading systems. If you want to learn about this, please go to this link here. It has a nice short 4 or 5 minute video explaining. The price recently has shot through the roof at above 50 euros, and you can still see it was under 24 as early as recent as last summer. So here the idea is to change prices and make it attractive to change your behavior.
Karl, if I may, we just got one question.
Yes.
Shall I read it to you?
Yeah, please.
So very clear and very well explained. Why does this has not implemented globally already?
Brilliant question. Brilliant question. I wish I had more time, and then we could talk about the prisoner's dilemma. And that has to do is that if I go clean, and this is what some Swiss voters say, look at Switzerland. We only are responsible for 0.1% of all the emissions. I have the high cost now. Yeah, I try to do something, but everyone else is still polluting. So the idea is, on the global scale, there is no, what economists call, a social planner who says, we are in bad shape. Listen, people, you need to change your behavior. You have 200 and some countries around the world, and everyone is looking out for her and himself. And I always say, you go ahead. Let me pollute. You go ahead. And then you say, no, Karl, you go ahead. Yeah, and then nobody does this everything. So at this point, I would love to talk a little bit of game theory. Or if you don't want to learn about it, become an EMBA student. My colleague Phil Rosenstein talks about it in the EMBA program. And that would be lovely to explain that. So I can give you readings on that. Shoot me an email. Sadly, great question. But if I go into details, we're still here in 2 hours. So back here. This now, the idea of carbon permits or carbon tax is to move the cost curve up to the social cost. The carbon tax or carbon permit price is an example of a so-called Pigouvian tax, named after Mr. Pigou, who after, this must be 1918, 1919, is the first to write about this idea. So that the idea is, you have to go into the markets and change the market. And now here, listen to this. Again, these economists that I mentioned there are there's some absolutely free market extremists. They even say that. Markets are great. They are awesome. However, here we have a market failure, and therefore we need to intervene. And then they call it a carbon dividend, because then they want to take the money that comes and not burn it on or do something stupid with it, but then invest it into greener technology and reward people or companies that are greener. So, big picture, carbon tax and emission trading systems, this is coming from governments. Now, currently we see around the world that more and more companies do voluntary net zero pledges, or maybe not so voluntary because their stakeholders, their shareholders, their owners put that pressure on them. So there's now a big market, growing market on voluntary carbon markets. What is that? Your company says, we want to be net zero by 2035, by 2040, but your production doesn't allow that, because you need some oil, maybe you need plastics. And so you will always emit CO2. Now the idea is you're going to offset it by somewhere else in the world, maybe in your home countries, maybe somewhere else, you pay money so that carbon is reduced. Carbon there is sucked out of the atmosphere, or less carbon is emitted, so that you can counter that. So perhaps this is wishful thinking, but there's a task force. There was just last month, it was announced that in Singapore, there's a new exchange where these will be traded. So the idea is, if you are a polluter, say in your home country, you go to somewhere in the world, Brazil, Southeast Asia, where there's deforested land, you reforest it. What then needs to be done, and that's still sort of a bottleneck here, you need a validation and verification that you really did this. You get some carbon credits, and then you can tell to your home government, hey, we are doing something good, perhaps not here, but a carbon atom or CO2 molecule here is the same as in Brazil or Southeast Asia. And a company that's already doing this is Ypsomed in Solothurn here in Switzerland. 2 nights ago, the big Swiss newspaper NZZ, New Zurich newspaper, had an event, and Simon Michel, the CEO of Ypsomed, talked. And he said, listen, we are producing plastic products that are very important for injections and so on. So for the pharmaceutical industry, for the medical industry, they are doing something great, an important product for all our health. However, they use plastic devices. Plastic is made from oil. So now they say we need to offset that. Yes, they want to be carbon neutral by 2030, but the CEO said, listen, we will always have a carbon footprint, always. Yeah, these things are made out of plastic. You can't make these things out of wood. So, therefore, well, we need to offset. And so now they are planting trees in Kenya, in a deforested area, where they then want to show, they're not there yet, how they suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and then can sort of do the math. We have so much CO2 here in Switzerland that we emit, and so much CO2 we're taking out of them. So to summarize, we have these Pigouvian taxes, what I call a stick. Carbon taxes, carbon permit. Now, voluntary carbon credits are not taxes, but you pay them. Now, briefly, I want to talk about carrots. Governments, policymakers are also throwing out subsidies and financial incentives to change this. Say, move people out of cars that burn fossil fuel to electric cars. So, for example, in Europe, there are quite a few countries, such as the UK, France, Belgium, Germany, Austria, Italy, Spain, and Romania, and others, who give financial incentives. So the idea now there is move some people out of the demand curve for old-fashioned cars and move them over there. Or if the demand curve is too low, increase the demand for these expensive products.
Karl, if I may.
Yes, please.
Sorry, we just got another question. Shall I read it?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So a question coming back to your overproduction argument. If we assume real demand, how can we say that something is overproduced? Sure, the price does not cover social costs, but if did, the quantity would decrease. But what does that mean? That China will start building less with concrete?
Okay, thank you. So demand is not constant. Yeah, so we have supply and demand. If prices go up, this is a pressure to innovate, to look for different products. There's also the pressure to substitute. Instead of this clinker or concrete, I may look for something else. So with innovation and substitution, the demand may change. Or I may say, oh, I would love to live in a concrete house, but it's too expensive for me. And therefore, I move over in something else. Yeah, people, as someone just said, people will search for alternatives. Now, thank you for the question. The European Central Bank, just like also the Federal Reserve and many central banks around the world, did quantitative easing. What is quantitative easing? Yeah, when we had the crisis during COVID, and then here in Europe already before that, and also in the US to lower interest rates, these central banks buy these bonds, they drive up prices, and then as you learned at IMD, when prices of bonds go up, the interest rates go down, and that affects the weighted average cost of capital of companies. When central banks do this, they are driven by market neutrality. So they say an A-rated company has lower interest rates than a BBB rated company, and we should keep it that way. We shouldn't change it around. So they try to lift all boats and keep the right order of the boats. Now the ECB is thinking about changing that, and buy greener bonds. Now there's a brand new study coming out of Stanford and the ECB. They looked at the bond portfolio of the ECB, and guess what? They buy more brown than green. because they go for the biggest companies. And so actually they are, so they are not green neutral even. They are bad green, good for brown. So it's completely crazy. Now there's a lot of political discussion. This market neutrality makes some people, that's the holy grail, and to break that will get people nervous. So again, these are topics that I'm just touching on. Climate change is the mother of all externalities. That's the takeaway for today. Because these externalities are not priced, we are producing too much of it, and we didn't change our behavior. The public policymakers, the regulators are fed up. They are massively going into it now with stick and carrot. Now, I want to go next. What does that mean for risk management and for the risk of institutions? So, of course, here's how BlackRock thinks about risk. There's a physical risk, the physical impact. This is when we hear the wildfires in Australia, floods in China, flood in Bangladesh, heat wave in the United States, fire in California. I don't have time to talk about this. I want to alert you to transition risk. People around the world are aware of this. Sometimes in Europe, people are a bit surprised on this, but this is a key, this is a killer for many businesses. There is transition risk as a result of regulation, innovation, and evolving consumer and investor preferences. What we saw with Exxon, suddenly now they have 3 environmentalists sitting on their board. There is the investors had different preferences and created now this issue, and as a result, Exxon will hopefully improve its behavior. Innovation, we have seen, because of subsidies and subsidized research, a huge decrease in the prices of solar power, in the prices of wind power. So you say, so what? So here, this is a cool thing. Download this and read it. It's a short reading. 5 sectors that cannot escape climate change from Morgan Stanley. The number 1 sector they give us, financial services, not coal-powered plants, not farming, not energy production. No, number 1, financial services. Financial services companies give loans to some polluting company. Now, what happens is there's an unpredictable or bad climate event. I don't know whether they call it green swan. Why don't they call it brown swan? Because green has a good annotation, but whatever. And so they say, and it's not just Morgan Stanley, there are policymakers also who are really worried about that a catastrophic climate event could result in a financial crisis. And then they also mention these transitional risks. Now you say, isn't that a little crazy? Financial crisis, huh? Well, that's nonsense. We're going to get to that. What is transition risk? As we move towards a less polluting economy, some sectors of the economy will face big shifts in asset values, higher cost of doing business. A key term to know is stranded assets. These are investments which have made, but which at some point you can no longer earn an economic return. Fascinating, where we see this right now is in California. California produces 80% of all the almonds in the world. 80% of all the almonds in the world. Right now, the allotment of water to some farmers has been decreased because they have a drought. So the farmers get water and the government says, sorry, we don't have enough. You get only 80% of what you usually get, or half of it. As a result, they have these beautiful almond trees, which they are now cutting down and shredding. Perfectly fine trees because they need so much water. On a tiny scale, a great example is a Keystone XL pipeline. This is a pipeline going from Canada, this red one, a shortcut, and a bigger one than the old black one, of oil to take oil from Canada into the US to the Gulf of Mexico. Sorry. That wasn't supposed to happen. It's off. Sorry about that. So, and then of course, the former president in the United States, dumb moron, had no idea what that means. But he was told the native Indians are against it, and the Greens are against it. So obviously his reaction was, we're going to build that. So they started to prepare to build this. On January 20th, a new president came in. And in the afternoon, he sat down and in front of TV, signed some executive orders. One of the first executive orders is, this pipeline is not allowed to cross the border. Game over for the pipeline for now. Of course, this is America. They sue now, and this will be in the courts for decades. So, and now there is this beautiful link to CNN. Watch that. I don't have time to show it to you, where they describe the investments that some people already made along the path of the pipeline. And there's this beautiful quote by the journalist talking over the footage and says, and this investment is just stranded. And you see these pipes lying there. Yeah, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or millions had been invested. And with the stroke of a pen, boom, the pipes are fine. You could use them. Yeah, so that's on a tiny scale. On a huge scale, look at this. Scientists say that we have a particular carbon budget, which means how many gigatons of CO2 and CO2 equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent means methane and nitrous oxide are translated into sort of a carbon number. And if we want to reach the 2% goal, this is how much we are allowed, this is our carbon budget, 850 gigatons. Now, what does that mean? That means we can do blue. That's all the Saudi oil, the cheapest oil in the world, and to get out of the ground. So we can burn all the oil that's known in Saudi Arabia and a lot more. If we want to go to 1.5 degrees Celsius, then we're here at under 500. We can burn again all that oil from Saudi Arabia and a bit more. What's on the right-hand column? Look at this. Here we see all the fossil fuels that are in the ground, the proven reserves. We can burn all the oil in Saudi Arabia, all the other oil we know of, then the gas, and then we have all the coal. And then we're here, and then we're all dead and fried. So we can't burn most of this if we are serious about this goal. We're going to fail. I'm a pessimist. We're going to fail. But let's say, we wanted to do this. Now, then you say, okay, we leave it in the ground. Big deal. It's not a big deal. Not so easy. Because where else is this? It's in the ground, but it's also on companies' balance sheets as assets. And so companies like the oil company have proven reserves in the ground, and there's a value on it. BP last year wrote off a cool 17.5 billion pounds on oil reserves from Canada because they're so dirty, this Canadian oil sand, and the marginal costs are high. They say, we're never going to be able to do this. So now the issue is, okay, what happens when write-offs start? Or what happens if a company, one of these big players, goes broke? But now look at the banks. Here we have the banks and their loan exposure to fossil fuel companies. JP Morgan has a cool $267 billion of loan exposure. And now let's say these loans go bad because you have stranded assets and some bankruptcies. Hey, JP Morgan, can you afford to write off 50 billion? Easy, we are JP Morgan. Can you afford to write 100 billion off? 150 billion off? So now JP Morgan may fail. And we all know from Lehman what that means. So this is now what people worry about, that from climate risk, transition risk, we get to financial risk. Morgan Stanley is very worried about. One of the biggest risks that investors face is that financial markets are not pricing in the effects of policy responses. These policy responses are an externality now to the markets, and there's no price on it. Now, the Bank of International Settlements here in Basel is more positive. The central banks have been looking at this. The central banks and policymakers, regulators are worried about this. They are really worried about this. So they trying to devise this. Now, unfortunately, we're running out of time. I say already goodbye to those of you who want to leave. I will go 5 minutes over because I want to wrap up and I want to talk just a tad on risk management of what needs to happen and what your company needs to do. Chris, please now the second poll. In your industry, in your company, do you talk about transition risk? Do you talk about how regulations affect you or not? So would you say you don't face transition risk? Do you say we face little transition risk, but it's peanuts, it's round of error. If we lose $1 million here or there, it's not a big deal. We face risk, but we're not really doing much about it. We need to, but we are not. Or we are very concerned and we are on it. And here are the results. Half of you are very concerned about transition risk and are working on it. A quarter, that worries me. A quarter says we face substantial transition risk, but ignore it. Please do change that. Or if you can't change it, tell your boss to change it. 20% are optimistic that they face little transition risk and can ignore it. And 16 people, 8% say they don't have transition risk. Earlier, I saw a question where people asked how many people are voting, a tad above 200. So thank you, Chris, for that, and all of you here now. This is, I think, what we all need to talk about is what's happening in the world. Yeah, I didn't have time to talk about physical risks. But clearly you're aware of them, heat waves, floods, and so on. The transition risks that we are seeing right now, and policy and regulation, technology development, and so on. These risks have an effect on macroeconomy as a whole, on businesses as producers and households as consumers, on the micro and macroeconomics. On a macro level, this is where I do research, people call this a damage function. How do these physical risks, these transition risks, do damage to the macroeconomy? Of course, this is very poorly understood. So that's one big issue. Then, okay, now we see these risks. But now comes a big question for the financial sectors and banks, financial intermediaries, households, businesses, governments are borrowers for you or business partners for you. Now here we see credit risk, market risk, and operational risk, liquidity risk. Now this is an interesting question. Yes, Bogdan, insurers. Yeah, the companies who are really, I think, far ahead here are Munich Re and Swiss Re, the big reinsurance companies, because for them, these are billions and billions of losses every year. So now, but here's now the problem. Statistics, I'm a data person at heart. For those of you who had my classes, you know that. But the problem is here, data science falls short because we only look at past data, but we're looking at forecasts, and we are in an area of data where we have never been. I didn't have time to show you this. The parts per million for CO2 in the atmosphere is at the highest in hundreds of thousands of years. So there, just straight line forecasting, like regressions, ain't gonna cut it. Scenario analysis is the answer here. Here now we need, and we're in the process of developing scenarios. What happens if this forecast happens? from the climate scientists, or that, or that. So that's really what's going on here. And then for those of you who took my AMC class, real options will be, I think, very helpful there, because we may need to change action as we go along the way. Now here, this in itself is another hour or another full IMD session to really get into the nitty-gritties. But it's not for a lunch talk on a Friday or an evening dinner talk for some of you. Now, here's something that I think sometimes people, in particular green politicians here in Europe, forget. When we go green, there are huge costs to this. And there will be some losers. And if we don't reimburse these losers, if we don't, they are not going to jump on the bandwagon. We're going to have political unrest. We may have political parties who are against this. So the key word is just transition. How do we transition in a just manner? Here, the EU, very political, complex mess. We all hate to bitch about, like to bitch about the EU and the mess. But when you have 27 parties at the table, they are winners and losers. And the losers are mad. And so they are aware of this. So the EU is aware of this, and they now go in and try to remedy this. For example, to give you just one concrete example, the country of Poland has a lot of coal plants, and Poland has a lot of active coal mines. You can't just tell the Polish people, sorry guys, game over. Tomorrow, no more coal. Then they sit in the dark. Then their businesses don't get electricity. So Bogdan says subsidize. That's what's happening. But then some people, Bogdan, say socialism. We don't want that. So at the same time, we want to incentivize Poland to move away. We need to move away. And so this is, again, another hour by itself. The transition and the just transition. Here, the red areas are all areas that the Europeans think, where we have real issues. A lot of them are coal mining areas. For example, in France, Alsace, and so on. So this is a huge problem. It's an even bigger problem in developing industry, in developing countries. India, Indonesia, Malaysia, they all want to increase their GDP. They want to get as rich as America. A lot of their energy comes from coal plants. So, sorry, I was thrown off by Paul's question, which I can't answer, because I don't know Denmark well enough. Karl, concentration. There, you can't switch off the coal plants. So I think this is a huge area. And now someone, when Chris read the question, why are we not doing something on a global scale? That's exactly what's needed. I think the Swiss voters, they say we are green enough, but we understand the problem. So the question is, how can we take money from Europe or from the US or other rich countries, sorry if I didn't mention your country, and help the world in the transition? Because just transition is not just the Polish coal miners or the Alsatian coal miners. It is on a global level. And I think we need more cooperation there, but then we talk, and then nothing happens. To summarize the takeaways, once you understand climate change as an externality and you see the reaction of policymakers to it, then you understand clearly the physical risk, the transition risk. Yes, there's transition from innovation, but in particular also from regulation or from our changing taste. So causing harm by going green. Don't forget that. And in particular to all of you who are here in Europe or Australia, New Zealand, please don't forget that. It's not that easy. Here's the crazy thing. ESG, the E and the S are sometimes enemies, or maybe enemy is too strong. They are competing for attention. And when you go greener, you are doing social harm. Think about this. You turn off coal, lots of electricity is gone overnight. We need electricity. So the big challenge for policymakers, for us as humanity on the planet, is to find a just transition. This is a challenge. And yes, be green, be a tree hugger. It's all good. But don't forget the poor. And we know, the first people who get harmed are the poor in these transitions. So a big thank you to all of you for those of you who had the time and could stay around this late. I apologize. I have this problem that I preach. So this was a macro view. I apologize to those who wanted investment advice and wanted to talk about bonds. We could do this in another session. If you want to think about sustainable business transformation and what you can do internally in a company, this is a program for you. So I hope, be safe, be well, and be good to IMD. Keep us in your mind. And thanks for attending. I hope to see you again in another webinar or ideally on campus. Thank you for your nice comments, and thank you and goodbye. Be safe and well.